Hello, this is Jessica, and the article we will be looking at today is Black to the Future by Mark Deary. Mark Deary is an American who was born on Christmas Eve, December 24, 1959, in Massachusetts. He is an author. He's also a literary critic. He taught media criticism and literary journalism at NYU for 8 years, between 2001 and 2009. He's best known for the article we'll be looking at today, which introduces writings on criticism on Afrofuturism. The question that I will be looking at is, why don't more African Americans write comics or speculative fiction when the concept of being one of a kind is common, or the idea of being trapped is relative for the African American? Before we get into that, I want to define what Afrofuturism is. Afrofuturism, defined by Mark Deary, is speculative fiction that treats African American themes and addresses African American concerns in the context of the 20th century techno culture, and more generally African American significance that appropriates images of technology and a prosthetically enhanced future. My understanding of all of that is that it's basically a merge or intersection of the African diaspora with technology. The first quote I'll be looking at is systematic oppression. That's what I summarized it as: systematic oppression. The quote says, "No migrant group, neither Irish, Italians, Germans, Jews, Scandinavians, for all the prejudices that all of them met when they got here and which they all had to overcome, endured such massive cultural destruction. And because it was inflicted on us, the country's been paying for it ever since." To break that quote down a little bit, I just want to talk about how hard it was for slavery to even be discussed in general. Because, not until recently, images were seen of it, and we don't know that much of slavery. We know a lot of slavery, but we don't know as much as we should, because a lot of it was destroyed. The article talked about how children were sold from their families. So we learn more that no two slaves, even from the same area, when they came in together with the slave pens, no two slaves from the same area were even in those pens. It's as if America tried to destroy anything of the African social conscious, which is a systematic way of oppressing the African American race. Here, this comic is actually in the article. It's from 1993. It's about a guy named Hardware, who is a black robot. He breaks through glass, which can be metaphoric for the African American male breaking through the glass ceiling. The comic is labeled Angry Black Man, but upon my research, his comic name is Hardware, like I did say. So it's as if, why would you restrict him? And he has no control. Then you call him the Angry Black Man. I mean, why wouldn't he be angry? You're restricting him for no reason. In the comic, something is also holding his shoulders down. So although he has broke the chains and seems like he's able to fly, he's still restricted. If you look closely, on the top left, it says escape is impossible until one perceives all barriers. So it can be looked at as maybe a quote-unquote motivational message towards the African American race, that maybe although they are going through these barriers, it is something that must be undergone in order to attain freedom. which is absurd. Another quote that I want to look at from the Dairy article, I'm sorry. Putting It's on page 209 to 210. It says, putting African Americans into alien scenarios. There is always this insertion of black figures into a visionary landscape, if not a science fiction or fantasy landscape. The imaginative leap that we associate with science fiction in terms of putting the human in alien and alienating environments is a gesture that repeatedly appears in the work of black writers and visual artists. Mark Deary says, the positioning of oneself literally as a stranger in a strange land. So to go into this a little bit, it's as if like adopting the robot kind of character responds to another situation, which is capitalism, of course. It's like they dehumanize people or African Americans by putting them into scenarios of aliens or robots in order to just say perhaps they're just laborers, which robots can also be looked at, and as slaves were once looked at, of course, laborers. It's like, but putting actual, alien armor or body armor to suit them as robots is basically placing them under the category of non-human, identifying them as an alien completely. And then I want to also look at another quote, which is on page 210. It says, there's no question there's a tendency among people who live under extraordinary oppressive conditions too long for a time when they had more control over a smaller space. But the dream of a place where one is liked to the universe in a more spiritual and philosophical way is too often part of a post-colonial white fantasy, which by definition depends on the domination of another group of people for its restriction of that Arcadian time. I just wanted to say I do agree with this quote completely. I do feel like quite often black writers feel they must write about a black character escaping or being free from society's hold, opposed to a white writer who might write about a black character as the villain or a black character only to kill him within the first couple of scenes in a film. This is where we kind of get Deary talking about how speculative fiction can be looked at as segregated, and he does talk about the redistribution of commodities and how they're organized. Like, they do know exactly who they're intending to sell to, who their audiences are, and this is quite often the intention. And this is also goes back to the main question of why more African American writers do not write speculative fiction when the concept of being one of a kind is common, or the idea of being trapped is relative for the African American. They're now looking at Afrofuturism with a completely new definition. And that definition is that Afrofuturism is a way to escape bleak projectors of a bleak future. Imaginations soar against the odds of racism, police brutality, and oppression. So Afrofuturism is now looked at as more positively, and it's not just tied down to the main character trying to free from the oppressors. But now it's like the main character is black, and then they're just living their life in this new imaginative land. There are artists that create albums embodying futurism completely, and some of these artists were talked about in class, such as Janelle Monáe in her album Metropolis, and another one that I found is Erykah Badu in her new album New America. These images both portray these African American women with futuristic concepts. As you can see on the third image, Janelle Monáe has sort of Wizard of Oz, the land of Oz on her head, it seems, in a cap form. In the first picture, which we did talk about in class, you see she only has one arm. It's as if she has a barcode, which, can signal slavery being sold. She has her arms ripped off, her legs ripped off, which can also mean, either working hard, working, body parts off, or, just being sold, pieces of her being sold, pieces of her personality being sold. Erykah Badu as well, in her image, she shows many of things. She shows cemetery, she shows machinery, which also Derry talks about. And back to MK Jemison. MK Jemison talked about how she felt as if she could relate to this music, specifically Janelle Monáe's, upon watching films that she used to watch, where upon watching the music video, of Janelle Monáe, because usually she would watch science fiction movies like Tron, and she found that the black characters would die, like I said earlier, within the first, couple of scenes. But upon watching Janelle Monáe's music video, she's seen things where the African Americans were the powerful ones. She saw people that she could relate to, people that were like her, and they were not the villains. She started noticing at a young age, Jemison, that the inclusion of African Americans in TV was not just like an innocent neglect, but it was on purpose. And to go back to Erykah Badu, her album specifically, since it was not talked about in class, is basically a new America that she created. It talks about a society on her own trying to address the current conditions of Black Americans, or Black America, Black Americans in Black Americans in Black America. And this is Black to the Future.